Hi, we complete our journey through 2 Samuel 6 today with the story of David and Michal as David dances in the streets with the celebration of the ark's return to the city of David, but Michal sees it differently, as we'll see in just a moment. So on the right side of the screen, you can see we've been going through these various acts of consolidating his royal reign and providing divine legitimation for why he is king over Israel and Judah. And as you can see so far, we've gone through his taking of a city from the Jebusites to become the city of David. We've seen him gain a powerful supporter in King Hiram of Tyre, who will also be a supporter of his son Solomon. We've seen him display masculine power and fertility by taking a series of unnamed women and having 11 more named children. We've seen him rely on Yahweh for military authority by inquiring, sha'aling, if you will, the verb for to ask or inquire, of Yahweh whether he should attack the Philistines. And now we're looking at the redemption of the past national shame of losing the ark. And we've been looking at the story of the ark and its parallels with the story in 1 Samuel 6, but injected into this story of the ark is a different story. It's related to the ark indirectly, but it's very much a part of his consolidation of his reign once we get that this is the context of why this story was put right here. And we'll also set up what we'll see right after this, the famous and perhaps infamous chapter of 2 Samuel 7, where we first hear of David's royal prophet Nathan, who claims that Yahweh has promised David a dynasty forever. So we'll see the complexity of that, and then we'll continue with these other acts of royal consolidation. As we've been looking at key words here, there aren't that many in this scene. We're looking at verse 16 and 20 to 23. So the first verse is up here, and where she despises him, and then it's down here. And it's really the issue of the face of Yahweh and the house. And we've been looking at how house was a key word, both in chapter 5 and chapter 6. We see it many times here, different people's literal buildings, but also house as a dynasty, or the house of Israel as the entire people of Israel. So many plays on house, and that will continue in the next chapter. So we'll be looking at that as well. So let's enter into our story here. And as we begin to look at our first verse, we already need to pay attention to something that the text doesn't tell us, but if we're listening carefully, we can see. As Sound notes below, the verse seems to interrupt the sequence of divine warrior victory ritual elements, and he links it to Judges 5:28, where, quote, the woman who peered through the window is aligned with the enemy of the dying warrior, with the cursed people who did not come to the warrior's help. And there's some link there, but perhaps there's something else going on here of why this is put here, because as we'll see, this foreshadows what we're going to see in verse 20, that the bringing of the ark in raises a real question, not just about David and Michal, but about the ongoing relationship between the house of Saul and the house of David, which we saw several ritual acts about their attempted connection via Abner and their dissolution, as we saw via Joab in the previous chapters before David was declared king over Israel and Judah in chapter 5. So with that in mind, let's begin to enter in our little passage. So as the ark of Yahweh came into the city of David, suddenly the attention shifts. Michal, daughter of Saul. As McKinley notes, nowhere even in the larger narrative does the text describe Michal, so we know nothing about what she looks like. But she's described as by the narrator as the daughter of Saul, not the woman of David, as we see. And it recalls the animosity between the two houses, as we'll see in the immediate verses, and then we'll see in the interesting verse in 21:8 that we'll look at as a little footnote. So Saul looked out of the window, and the daughter of Saul, not Saul looking out the window, he's long dead. She looked out of the window. And as Rosenberg notes below, I think very nicely, the ecstatic king is framed as in a picture, or viewed as text by a commentator. The house of David as seen from the house of Saul. The king's presumably exposed genitals house the quote-unquote house that is to replace Michal's, yet momentarily she is housed, and the king and his privates are unhoused. Rosenberg and Polzin and others really note how the story goes through all kinds of word plays around house and the views of that. And as some commentators have noted, without there being a house, there'd be no inside and outside. And so she's in the house, which is the natural place in patriarchy for women, and he's outside, which is a natural place in patriarchy for men. But as we'll see in verse 20, she's going to leave her proper women's place to go out to his place. But first, we're hearing her perspective and seeing it from her view. So she saw here, and as McKinley again notes, just as she is daughter of Saul rather than wife of David, so David is seen by her in his official role as King David. So she doesn't see her husband, she sees King David. And we note here, he is described as King David here, but how many times he's simply described as David? Throughout all these, he's not given his title. So this is clearly Michal's perspective, that she sees King David, to whom she's been returned, and we'll come back to that in a minute. Leaping and dancing before Yahweh, and she despised him in her heart. The phrase for leaping and dancing, Maphazon Mekharker here, only one other time, Maphazon only one other time in Genesis, is a long scholarly debate about the meaning of the terms. McKinley suggests prancing and skipping rams, and Seow follows that, noting that it seems to be describing animal movement, and he ventures on to say this: I would venture to suggest that David and his retinue were participating in dances imitating animal movements. Their purpose, to judge from the sequence of events in the procession, was to dramatize the dance of nature before the divine warrior. And that may well be. Fackelman describes it as leaping and clapping, thus pointing to the feet and hands of David. But regardless of what we think the details are, whether it's animal-like or focusing on David's feet and hands, he's doing it, the narrator tells us, and she sees him doing it, this is her perspective, in the face of Yahweh, and she despised him in her heart. As Will Gaffney notes, after all she has done for him, he has abandoned her. But down here we see the note from Rosenberg, who says, David's role here is institutional and bespeaks of changes in Israel, a return perhaps to the sense of king and temple that prevailed in the heyday of pagan culture in the land. Putting aside the anachronistic use of pagan, Rosenberg was writing in the 80s, and I don't think he would frame it that way now. It's suggesting that despite the Yahwistic presence throughout this chapter, that what David is here doing is perhaps appealing to the ordinary person's previous understanding of who they were. We have no idea, of course, if ordinary people are following Yahweh in this time or not. How would we know? We don't know. Although we've seen several references to the writer talking about the collective, all Israel or all the house of Israel. But down to the individual person, we don't know. It's much like saying Catholics believe, but if you ask an individual Catholic, they may not believe what quote-unquote Catholics believe. So she despises him in her heart, contrasting with how she loved him so deeply in the beginning. And the point I want to get to is we're seeing this as if it's just David and Michal looking out the window. But we've seen that David has many wives. And where are they? And where are all the children? So let's take a look here at David's women, because as I've noted many times in this and other Hebrew Bible series I'm doing here at Radical Bible, there is no word in Hebrew for wife or husband. There's simply the possessive, his man, or his woman, or her man. If it was his man, that would be interesting too, but we don't see any of those. So let's go through the sequence, and I've color-coded them according to who they are. So the women of Saul, Merab and Michal, are in blue. Abigail is here in pink, and when it's Abigail and Michal together, it's the combined blue and pink and purple. And then I made gray for the others who are just mentioned once, or the anonymous ones down here. And then Bathsheba in green. So, and I notice we go through these so much for anybody who's raised in a Christian environment that says Christian marriage or godly marriage is between one man and one woman. Because throughout this section, there's no sense that Yahweh is objecting to the multiple wives or the multiple children. And in fact, of course, when Solomon is king, the text will say he had 700 wives and 300 concubines. And the text's theological judgment against him on Yahweh's behalf is not because of the multiple women, but because some of them are foreign, and they led his heart astray. So there's no criticism here of multiple women whatsoever. And if we're reading Genesis, of course, Abraham had 2 women, and Jacob had 4, and there's no criticism of any of that. So biblical marriage is plainly not what some fundamentalist Christians have later determined it is. It's certainly very normal for a man to have many women here, and that makes biological sense as well as royal sense, because from a royal sense, as we've seen, having many women is a show of male power. But from Jacob's perspective, it was not that kind of man, but as a woman's man, as we saw in the Genesis story. It provides a chance of having more children, because of course a man can impregnate many women at a time, but a woman can only bear one child at a time. So there are many reasons for why it might be perfectly natural for a man to have many women, and Yahweh has no judgment on that. So Saul starts off to give David Merab. That sounds like a good thing, but he thought, I will not raise a hand against him, the Philistines will deal with him. So he's offering to give Merab as a snare, and he'll offer to do Michal the same thing. For reasons we don't know, he took Merab away. And we see in a passage in 2 Samuel 28 that Merab had 5 children from Adriel, although some of the texts say that's Michal. I don't know many of the translations that say that, but we'll get there when we get there. So then we find out that Michal's daughter loved David, and Saul gave him his daughter Michal as a woman back in chapter 18, again thinking that it would get him killed. But it doesn't get him killed, and in fact it gets Michal to be on David's side, just as Michal's brother Jonathan is on David's side, back in 1 Samuel 19. And so, as in the previous chapter, Saul was upset at his son Jonathan for siding with David, now he's upset at his daughter for siding with David. But then, a few chapters later, David sends and woos Abigail, the widow of Nabal, and she's always called that. We've looked at that before. Abigail of Carmel, Nabal's widow, and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. She's not described as David's wife. She's described that way as if there's something suspicious about how David got her. But it also says he married Ahinoam of Jezreel. And it doesn't say this, but as many commentators, especially Halpern and others, who aren't afraid to peel back the layers a little bit, suggest Saul's wife is named Ahinoam too. Could he have married Saul's woman? And we hear nothing about her except this description here and the parallel description that she's named with Abigail. But she is described as having a child, Amnon. And Amnon will be the son who rapes his half-sister Tamar and is killed by his half-brother Absalom. So to the extent that Ahinoam represents a hidden Saulite potential son, Amnon is the incestuous result of that, and he gets killed. So just as Michal will have no children, as we'll see momentarily through David, or otherwise, as far as we can tell, neither will Ahinoam, whether she's Saul's former wife or not. So at this point, David has these two women, but for a while, Michal was given to Palti, son of Laish, and then was brought back, as we see. So later, they're brought back. And so up until the beginning of 2 Samuel, he has these two, Ahinoam and Abigail. And now we hear at the beginning of 2 Samuel 3, before we get to our immediate scenes of royal consolidation, 6 women and 6 sons. So we see Ahinoam bears Amnon, as we saw, Chileab, who we hear nothing else about, from Abigail, Absalom from Maacah, daughter of King Talmai of Geshur, whom Absalom will go back to, we'll see, but we know nothing else about her. Adonijah, son of Haggith, whom we know nothing about. Shephatiah, son of Abital, whom we know nothing about, and Ithrim of Eglah, whom we know nothing about. Notice in this sequence, only Eglah here is described as a woman or as a wife. None of these are described that way, and it really stands out that the last one is in the face of the others not, as if they bore him children without him ever engaging in some kind of ritual that was marriage. We can't know that, though, because we only have these little details here. So then, when Saul is dead and Ishbaal, Saul's son, looks like the potential successor, David makes a point of consolidating this by bringing Michal, Saul's daughter, back to him, highlighting that he paid the price of 100 foreskins, although we saw it was 200 in the act. Then we found out, just in the chapter before our current one, he takes more what are described in many texts as concubines, but I explain why that's not a good translation now. Secondary women and primary women. We don't know how many, but they bear 11 more children. These seem to be spread out over the coming years, whereas these up here were born at Hebron. So by the time we get to our scene in 2 Samuel 6, all these sons are born, and David has had relations with 6 different women, and Eglah is still described as David's woman here. And so when we get to the Bathsheba scene, and she will be described as Uriah's woman, just as Abigail is described as the widow of Nabal, and just as Ahinoam described as Jezreel, but leaving out the Saul part, but highlighting the connection there. So David's had many women, and so why, although Bathsheba won't be in the scene until several chapters later, so why in this scene in 2 Samuel 6 do we only see Michal? Where are all the children? Where are the sons? And there are going to be daughters born, as we see described in chapter 5, but we don't know when over the course of David's reign those were born. We know there's one, Tamar. But we see nothing about that. It's as if Michal was home alone. In the art, as you can see on the picture, I use the cover picture, and I can put it up here, we see Michal presumably with the other women of David, although they're not named there, and we can't really know. We don't know what any of them look like, of course. So it suggests all of them are looking out the window, but then only Michal's the focus. We might wonder, what are the other women thinking about David dancing in the street? But we hear nothing about it. We hear nothing about them ever. So with that in mind, whether that's a function of patriarchy or the narrative art here, focusing on Michal, the Saulite daughter, or the others are not quite so relevant in this moment of consolidation, you can decide for yourself. So We've already looked at that. We already looked at that. So saw King David leaping and dancing, and she despised him. So we're going to go down a few verses to see the rest of our passage, starting here in verse 20. So after David provides a mediocre amount of food for people, and they all go back home, we see him return to his own house. As you can see, Brueggemann has pointed out there's a tight little chiasm in these three verses, 20 to 22, which you can see on the screen here in these little words. So it's, what happens is she speaks and he responds in the same language. So he returns to bless his house, again acting as a priest. As Polza notes, the only place where David's house is blessed, and he does it himself. But now we hear Michal, the daughter of Saul, again described as that. As David Klein's notes below, the conflict that began in the bedroom ends in the street, referring to the bedroom scene back here where she covered him up and hid him for the sake of her, David escaping from Saul. So she came out to meet David. As Falkman notes, means that she spits venom at David more or less in public. And as Cheryl Axum, from a feminist perspective, has noted, this is a bold act on her part. Axum doesn't note, but I will, that this is leaving the traditionally female indoor space and going directly into the male space to confront him. And even though the servants' maids are out there, they're not of any threat. They're the lowest of the low. So their being in the male space is plainly serving the man, not claiming any authority there in the public space. But she is, by speaking up, and speaking up in public in a way that would, with sarcasm, that would certainly embarrass the king if he was able to be embarrassed, but as we'll see, he's not. So notice that she's described as the daughter of Saul, and she sees him, she saw him as the king, King David, and now she names him as the king of Israel. Not my husband, not David, but simply the office holder. And although what she will say will suggest that what she's upset about is his sexual promiscuity, or at least a suggestion of it, by his dancing practically naked in the ephod in the streets, what it's really about is what the ephod is covering, which is potential children of hers and potential grandchildren for Saul, that would result in the uncomfortable situation of a Saul-eyed son or grandson in the house of David, in the city of David. So she's obviously well aware of that. So being aware of that, and as he is too, let's look more closely at what she says. So how the king of Israel honored himself or glorified himself, and she's clearly being sarcastic here today, uncovering himself, using the Hebrew word gal here, you can't translate, or you can't pronounce it easily without the vowels, but it's 3 times in the verse. It's uncovered here, and the shamelessly uncover represents a doubling, as the Hebrew often does with verbs to highlight intensification. So the same word used 3 times here. And what she names is that he's uncovering himself before the eyes of the servants' maids. Now, we have heard that he was dancing before the face of Yahweh, but she sees it before the maids. And the servants' maids, as Falkman notes, means the slave girls of your slaves. Amma in 2 Samuel here, as Polza notes, throughout the books of Samuel and Kings, women who are called handmaids work almost exclusively for the honor and glory of David's house. And we see that from Hannah, Abigail, the women of Tekoa, the wise woman of Maacah, Bathsheba, and 2 harlots in 1 Kings that we see there, who talk about the story of the child that died in the night, the little parable as I read it there. We'll get to that eventually. So, and then she compares it to as any vulgar fellow, using the infinitive absolute. The term for vulgar here is rake, only here in Samuel, meaning empty and vain. So she's really highlighting the contrast that although he's the king of Israel, he's acting like the lowliest person out there dancing with the lowliest women. Is she concerned with his lack of honor, or is she concerned with the possibility that his privates are exposed, and in other words, the future house is unhoused, as Rosenberg was suggesting? So now we see David's response. And Falkman, in going through much detail, argues that it should be translated differently. Let's look at the No RSV first, and then we'll listen to Falkman's version. So David said to Michal, "It was before Yahweh, or before the Lord, who chose me in place of your father and all his household to appoint me as prince before Israel, the people of Yahweh, that I have danced before Yahweh." He suggests this: it was before the Lord who chose me instead of your father and all his family to appoint me prince over the Lord's people in Israel. It was before the Lord that I played, and if I earn more disgrace than this is down to verse 22, so that I will be base in my own eyes, even though among the slave girls you speak of, among them I will be honored, including this verse here. I won't go through all the details of why he does that. That involves a lot of grammatical details in the Hebrew that you're probably not that interested in. So he says to Michal, it was before Yahweh, not, in other words, not before the servants' maids. I wasn't doing this to impress the girls in the street. I was dancing before Yahweh. He goes on to say, who chose me in place of your father? The word for chose, bakar, here is never used for Yahweh's selection of David. It was used in 6:1 for David's 30,000 quote-unquote chosen men. It is used for that of Saul. We can see back here in 1 Samuel 10:24. Samuel said to all the people, do you see the one to whom Yahweh has chosen? There's no one like him among the people, and that's Saul at that point. And the closest we see it to choosing David is in 16:10, 1 Samuel 16:10, where Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel, and Samuel said to Jesse, Yahweh has not chosen any of these. But when we get to verse 12, we don't hear the word chosen. We simply hear, rise and anoint him. This is the one. So it's interesting that the text never explicitly says that Yahweh chose David, although it does everything come right up to the edge of that. So David continues, who chose me in place of your father and all his house, which of course includes the daughter of Saul, and it will also include the son of Jonathan, who we'll see David take care of a little later, to appoint me not as king, but as Nagid, as prince, which is what we heard earlier, and we'll hear it also in 2 Samuel 7:8, through the mouth of Yahweh, through the mouth of Nathan. And as some commentators suggested, Nagid, prince is not a good translation. Prince sounds to our ears, I suggest, as the son of the king. But it's sometimes translated as simply as ruler in the prophets and otherwise. But it's suggesting this is the sacred title other than Melech as king. This is a ruler designated by Yahweh, and that somehow it's something different than a Melech, a king. But there's no practical basis by which I can see or other commentators have seen that Nagid suggests a different level of honor or a different kind of behavior from the person. But that's the word that's used here. As Nagid before Israel, the people of Yahweh. Notice, is Israel the people of Yahweh? Does that include Judah that he's also king over? Certainly Israel was the people of Yahweh that Saul was king over. Michal's father, that's what's at issue here. But he's already king over Judah too. But does that suggest they're not the people of Yahweh? It's for that reason that I've danced before Yahweh, or literally played, using a different word for dancing that we saw earlier. And this word, as we've seen, echoing from a number of places, including Exodus 32, has a sexual or at least erotic connotation. So he's not denying there's an erotic element to his dancing and his little ephod out in the street, but it's oriented toward Yahweh, not toward the women in the street. And then he continues on. As Falkman notes, Michal gets a taste of her own medicine, for now the king decides to deliver a replica using terms which originated with her: honor, women, and disgrace. As Klein suggests, perhaps with a wink, David finds religious ecstasy a good way of impressing women, if that's what he's about. So he continues, I will make myself yet more contemptible, or literally make myself small, or make myself accursed, and the qual and the nephal here, than this. And I will be abased in my own eyes, or I'll become lowly and humble in my own eyes. By the maids of whom you have spoken, by them I shall be held in honor. And as my note below has, popular opinion favors David even if the house of Saul rejects him. As McKinley notes, Michal's challenge has been roundly dismissed and the servant women co-opted by David. Further, Falkman adds, the painful implication of David's point is, after all, your abandoning me makes you less worthy than the plebes you have such a low opinion of. And to conclude his thought, by them I shall be held in honor or glory, highlighting the chiastic phrase there. As Fuel and Gun note, he will uncover himself even more degradingly he boasts, and will do so in confidence that he has something weighty. The other meaning of kabod for glory can also mean weighty, to show. And the narrator concludes this laconically, but with a very ambiguous note, and Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no child to the day of her death. And the ambiguity is rich. It doesn't say she withheld. It doesn't say he withheld. It simply said they had no child. So let's look at the various commentators' views on this last verse here. As Poulsen notes, Michal's despising of David and her subsequent childlessness to the day of her death may represent an ideal Israel that never was. The bitterness of Michal from Peter Borgen here, and the subsequent closure of her womb echo in precise reversal the original barrenness and bitterness of Hannah, whose barrenness and bitterness is transfigured into a mother's joy over the newborn life of Samuel. And I think it's really important to notice the frame here, because as I've been noting in the ark narrative, there were many echoes back to 1 Samuel 4, to Eli and his two sons and the corruption there. And so really back to the very beginning of the story. And so if it started with a childless woman having a child and joy, it ends now with a childless woman who will have no child and sadness. So we can also look from the other side. As Halpern notes, David therefore sequestered Michal. He ruptured her former union, then refused any real alliance with Saul's house. As Joel Baden notes, having Michal as a wife served a clear purpose for David. Having children with her, however, did not. Pinchansky offers three options for how we can interpret this: that God punished Michal with infertility, that David punished Michal by not sleeping with her, or Michal punished David by denying him the legitimacy of a child. All of those are possible, and I don't think we need to try to resolve that. And as Rosenberg notes, had David excuse the typo there, Michal produced an offspring, the question of monarchic succession would perhaps have been closed. Israel's and Judah's kingly houses would have become one, and political turmoil would presumably be averted. And yet, despite this, David's house thrives for a while. And we'll see how that continues and is promised, if not forever, at least for a long time, in the next chapter. See you then. Bye-bye.